for you.
Thank you. But it's a bit early for me.
Very good, Nadine. Nadia went to the trouble.
Yes, Nadine. I went to the trouble. Drink.
You should try.
Real talks, that just made such a mess. I got anxiety and cleaned it up off the counter right after.
Lovelies, here I am again, halfway done my makeup, and today I'm going to be talking about another interesting character and interesting story. It's going to be about the Serpent, also known as Charles Sobrage. So before I get into the real life story about this dude, I'm just going to talk about the Netflix show that I've been watching, which inspired me to make this video in the first place, and I'm going to finish up my makeup. My boob was about to pop out in the last clip, so let's make sure that doesn't happen. I'm assuming at least some of you have watched the show The Serpent on Netflix that was released recently. So The Serpent is about this dude who is an actual person who's been arrested, and he used to kill travelers. I think it was back in the 60s or 70s or both. People that were traveling the hippie trail. Back then, you know, we had no cell phones, we had no internet, so these travelers were serious. There were a lot of people coming from America and Europe and just wanted to see Thailand, Asia, India. So the show, it starts off with this girl and this guy who we later find out are the killers. It's this girl whose name is Marie, but they call her Monique. This is his girlfriend, the woman that he's basically brainwashed to be his partner in crime. In the show, they show these travelers kind of bounce between different timelines, and they also have another helper, you come to learn, named Ajay. This guy was an actual person too. So you start to see in the show that these different travelers meet him. This guy, Charles, says he's a gem dealer. He says that that is his career, but he uses these as a way to get close to tourists. They're from Europe, like I said, America. He sometimes has parties. He meets these people and lures them to his apartment, which is in Thailand. Most of the show takes place in Thailand, and it bounces back and forth. It shows you some of the travelers' stories, what happens to them, and it shows you about the investigation. He is taking people's passports and identities. He killed so many tourists. Charles's thing is once he gets his hands on these people's passports, it makes it hard for them to leave because he puts his pictures on everything. And back then you can just change up the passports. So they didn't have a way to get out. He had a connection with the Thai police apparently. He would slowly make these people sick. It's just really creepy because a lot of these people didn't know what was happening to them. It would happen so slowly. And he would pretend like he's helping them, like, oh, you don't want to go to the hospital, you're okay. But meanwhile, it's him and his sidekicks that are making them even sicker. When people tried to escape that were under Charles's watch, sometimes it would have to escalate the killings and he would do whatever it takes to quicken things up. Even in the first episode, they show you an American girl. I believe she was going to be a nun or whatever. So she was gonna go learn from the monks, and that party was her last night out. Drugged her, and she knew what was going on. She wanted to get away, but nobody would help her. The series also follows a dude who works for the Dutch embassy. His sister and her longtime boyfriend went missing. This is how the investigation starts, and they were actually victims of Charles. Got it pretty bad. I believe their bodies were burned alive, but they couldn't identify who these victims were, where they were from. It was making it increasingly hard for her brother, the guy who works for the embassy, to hunt them down. Charles lures them like he does most of his victims. First, ask them to buy some gems because Charles is all about that money, but they say they don't have any money to buy the gems because they're just poor travelers. But Monique feels bad for the girl. She knows that Charles is going to kill them. She tries to convince them to buy the jewels, but they don't. Boys got a haircut. They look amazing. Amazing, yeah. I'm done rambling about the show now. I'm going to tell you about the real life Charles Sobrage. If you haven't, definitely go watch the show. He is mixed race, and I guess this was rare where he came from back in these times. He was born to a Vietnamese mother and Indian father, and he was born in Saigon. One of the things that he said was a reason for his murder is to keep up with his lifestyle, his lavish lifestyle of traveling between continents and just going wherever he wanted, so he used his victims as a means to do this. He was a very charming man, you can tell, like most psycho serial killers. They're great at manipulating, which in one episode we see he did to this woman, Monique, who is actually named Marie. Basically, he groomed her into being his sidekick, and he would use this charm on these victims. He would befriend them, and then ultimately he would drug them and then dispose of them. He would then use their identities. This would let him travel from country to country with their identities and not being detected. Let's just talk about Charles. Before any of this murder happened, he did have a life of crime, but back then it was only petty crimes. He lived between Indochina and France, and even in the show you can tell he speaks fluent French. He even has, I guess, a French accent or accent of some sort. Before Marie came around, in real life, Charles actually had another wife. She was pregnant, I believe they had a child. Through with other crimes like robbing tourists and already traveling on their passports, stealing cars, burglaries, all of this before he got into killing people. Before Charles even committed his first murder, he had already befriended Ajay. If you look up Ajay, he's never been caught. Never found him. Some suspect he might have been killed, and then others spotted him after. Anyways, he helped Charles commit all these murders and murdered people himself. Their first victim was a woman named Teresa from Seattle. In the first episode, this does happen. The body is found floating in the Gulf of Thailand in a bikini. I guess they drugged her and then they just dropped her in the water, taking her identity. And she's the one that I mentioned was gonna be a nun and all that. In Thailand, Charles was alternating between posing as a drug dealer and a gem dealer. This is when he met Marie. Hooked up with her. She was a French-Canadian traveler, just like the show, and her name is Marie-Andree Leclerc. Her name is Marie-Andree Leclerc. She became the most devoted accomplice. In 1976, when Marie was making a testimony, she did talk about how Charles' favorite method to kill his victims was by making them ill. So much like the show. Tourists would come and stay with them. He would pretend like he's their friend, and he would use anything he could get his hands on to make them increasingly sick over time. Sometimes he would get medication that induced diarrhea, itching powder, honestly anything, and he would just use it all so that they felt like they were dependent on staying with him. And while this is all happening, he would take their identity and their passport so they can't really go anywhere. This method made these people weak and they needed to rely on him. So he ended up having the upper hand, and it made it easier for him to carry out his murders. He didn't always have them staying with him for long periods, but like in the show, the man Dominique, some of them did stay for long periods, like months. Wouldn't know what hits them till later. They would just think that they're sick, and Charles would say that he's giving them dysentery medication or something, and it was a ploy. They thought this medication Charles and Monique were giving them was making them better, but then slowly they would just keep getting sicker and sicker. If y'all don't mind, I'm gonna have to read this from the laptop because I've never heard of these medications in my life. According to statements, one thing that he really often used was calpectate powder, which is an antacid medication, which seems innocent enough. It actually is supposed to help stomach aches, but he would mix that with mogadon. And this is a hypnotic drug used for short-term relief from severe disabling anxiety and insomnia. Mixing these obviously gave a terrible effect. It made them no longer be able to function on their own, and they definitely became dependent on him. Other things that he used to use, Largactil, high sedative used to treat severe depression, and used an illegal drug, which you've probably heard of, called Quaaludes, you know, if you watch The Wolf of Wall Street. That's a sedative with hypnotic properties. Any of these things are obviously going to make you act some type of way. Even as we saw in the show, when he didn't have as much time, Charles would use fast-acting drugs to completely drug them, and then he would sadly murder them in other ways. Putting them on a downer, robbing them of their money and their passports, and then sometimes he would strangle, shoot, or mutilate them before burning their remains. There's a whole bunch more info online about Charles, but it's definitely a crazy story. And actually in the show, one guy who surprisingly escapes, Dominique, who was staying there a long time, and they show in the series the two neighbors at the Thailand apartment actually ended up helping him while Charles and Monique and Ajay were away. All of that actually happened. Dominique did survive, and he has a family. He just doesn't like reliving what happened there. He does recall what happened. It was that Charles befriended him. They had dinner together, went out together, and they were friends. But after he stayed at Charles' apartment, he started waking up feeling terrible, and it all just went downhill from there. Charles's whole arrest story is pretty confusing. From what I understood, the Dutch guy was actually a real dude and he hunted him down. All of that happened. I do know that while he was serving time in New Delhi, I guess he befriended everyone in that jail. 2 years left on his sentence there. He threw a party. All the people working at the jail and all the inmates or something, he somehow managed to get his hands on sleeping pills and drug all of them and just walk out of prison. After this, when he was actually caught again, this had added more time to whatever sentence he had, obviously. But because so much time had also passed since the Thailand murders, it was expired, so they couldn't charge him for these murders again. Something like that. Sometime after this, he moved to Paris and he was acting like a celebrity big shot. One place he could get arrested again that he was never charged for certain murders was back in India. And I guess he was just bored and decided, hey, I want to go back to Nepal. And as you might expect, someone did recognize him and he could actually be charged for murder there. He got arrested for the murder of 2 American backpackers. That happened there. Now he's still in prison to this day. He's serving a life sentence because he just needed to go back to Nepal. I've never heard of something like that. Anyways, that wraps it up for my story on the Serpent, aka Charles Sobrage. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys all next Sunday with a brand new video. Bye!